Hello, I'm Vaughn Vernon, and in case you aren't familiar with my work, I have worked a lot around domain-driven design for the past several years. I am a domain-driven design consultant, trainer. I program, I work in architecture, I review architectures, I teach architectures, I consult around architectures and so forth. And I've been doing this now for close to 43 years, which is more than half of the software industry's existence, I believe. And I really enjoy what I do. That's why I'm here at iSAQB. I'm not that old, really. I started when I was 5. I wasn't using DDD for those 40-some years, but somewhat surprisingly to people, the things that DDD is heavily based on, I was doing for quite a while, probably I would say from the late 80s, early 90s, I was working with, So I started in the industry in 1983. It was my first paid job where I was paid professionally to do work as a programmer. So object-oriented programming was around. If you go by the definition of Alan Kay, who coined the term object-oriented programming, started around the year 1972, at least when Smalltalk was initially introduced, Smalltalk 72. But object orientation didn't really get any kind of a foothold until, somewhat ironically, C++ showed up, and it claimed to be object-oriented, although Alan Kay, who coined the term, said, I can tell you that I did not have C++ in mind when I coined the term object-oriented programming. But it at least made people familiar with some of the concepts. So my first foray into object-oriented programming was with C++. I attended a meetup in 1984. It was the New York City's C programmer user group. It was right after my wife and I were married, and we returned from Brazil from our honeymoon, and I took her on the swankiest date that I could think of. We got a couple slices of pizza and went to the meetup in New York City. It was a lot of fun. She loved it. That's where I first learned about C++. I thought I was attending a C user group meeting, and it was, but they were actually talking about C++ that evening, and I think it was someone who had been working at Bell Labs in New Jersey and came over for this orientation on C++. So from that point, I started sort of backing my way into C++, and within a few years I was using it, but that actually kicked off an understanding, or at least a knowledge of Smalltalk, what was supposed to be the real object-oriented, and then I got into Smalltalk and was actually programming for a living in the early 1991 in Smalltalk. So it took a few years to actually get work in that, but that was the most exciting object-oriented environment that I've ever been in. And when it just sort of went away because of various reasons, they weren't as good at marketing as Microsoft was with Visual C++ or Borland at the time. Those other languages kind of took over, but there was no way to match the productivity that you could have in Smalltalk. And in the early 90s, it was estimated, I think there was a Newsweek article that claimed a 20 times increase in programmer productivity in the Smalltalk environment compared to C or C++. And I think that I experienced that. If I didn't, it was very close to that. It felt very empowering, and it was incredible the amount of work you could get done with it. And that kind of leads into our discussion about AI. It's interesting that right about now is 3 years since ChatGPT was announced, right, and released. I don't know, I don't remember the exact day, but it was pretty much like the end of November 2022, yeah? And if you go back that far, the claims being made were, I would say, quite outrageous. When I actually looked into it myself, I found that I was not impressed in the way that I thought I would be. Even probably I wasn't really experimenting much with AI or LLMs, ChatGPT, for about 6 months after that point. And when I started looking into it more and more, the more disappointed I became, honestly. I'll give you one experience. I was working on some insurance models, and I wanted to understand a broader perspective on how to calculate the rate of auto insurance based on the risk of drivers, where they lived, their age, pretty typical things, any traffic records that they had, and so forth. So I was looking into that. I scoured the internet through Google, and I really couldn't find much concrete information about it. And what I found really, and after talking to some insurance companies about this, those things are really secret. That kind of domain expertise is locked up inside. Now, I have worked with insurance companies over the years, and I do know that underwriting is something that's very secretive. But in the age of internet and Google being, able to scour the web and bring in all kinds of information, I thought, well, some 25 years after working with some insurance companies, actually insurance was my first paying job in 1983, an insurance-related domain. And I thought, hey, there must be a lot more information out there now, but there isn't. It's still locked down. So I said, I don't know how OpenAI could possibly get knowledge of some of these insurance models, but let me just try. I just want to see what they have. So I went to ChatGPT and I started asking some questions. I refined my prompt because that's what you do, you engineer prompts really well. And I was amazed at the answers that I got. I thought, this is crazy. How do they have this kind of information? Because they only have information that's on the internet, right? Isn't that true? I would think so. What? Did someone leak information out of some insurance companies? Were they, well, let's hope that wasn't the case. And it wasn't. It's called hallucination. And ChatGPT was just so interested in pleasing me that it was willing to tell me whatever it thought I wanted to hear. I didn't know this at the time because I was still impressed by it. I thought, this is incredible. I've just experienced the receipt of the mother lode of all insurance information, and I can just keep asking questions and it will just keep telling me because it is the ultimate domain expert in insurance. And then I contacted an author in my signature series, Joe Emerson, who happens to be a co-founder in a technology insurance company. And he's the CTO of the company, and he's built quite an interesting company. And I said, Joe, I was just wondering what ChatGPT told me here. What do you think of it? Is it as high quality as I get the impression that it is? And I won't tell you his exact words that he replied in an email, but it was sort of like, delete that, but with, some extra adjectives. I was a bit surprised, but not really in a way, because I said to myself, this seems impossible. How could it be? And it was impossible, except that ChatGPT was very, very convincing that it had this corner on the insurance market and algorithms and so forth for calculating insurance rates and the risk involved to reach those rates. But it was completely wrong. And my interest in AI at that point became very shattered. I just really said, okay, this has nothing to offer really. And it was probably pretty close to a year from that point before I started to hear a lot of realistic content show up, what I felt was realistic content about AI. And I attended a conference. It's the Explore DDD conference in Denver, Colorado, 2024. And Eric Evans was then presenting some information about using LLMs with DDD. And I just really wanted to hear what Eric had to say. And I think Eric's viewpoint at the time was mostly this is experimental. We have no real concrete evidence that this is going to work, but this is what I've been using. He was using a particular AI model at the time, which happens to end up being not the more popular ones these days, and it wasn't the most popular one at the time. But he seemed to be finding some success with it, and yet he didn't have kind of the anecdotal information that maybe we were hoping for. But I was encouraged by it. And so I keynoted, that was Eric's keynote, and I keynoted at the conference as well. And it fit my presentation to just sort of weave some speculation about how AI could be used in my topic, which was frangible or fungible, which is basically fragility and software failure versus the ability for software to recover from failure. Okay, frangible versus fungible. And so I speculated on that, and it's interesting that things haven't really led to the point where I think what I speculated on could work, but I haven't ended up using AI in that way. So I've had a range of impressions and feelings about AI. I am more impressed now with the way that I have been using LLMs, and most of my positive experience has been with Claude Code. So we can talk about that more. So the cost of AI overall to the world, to society, to the ecology and the economy. I hear a lot of negative things about it, and I have to admit this is not my area of expertise. I do think that spending trillions of dollars on a single AI chip just sounds absolutely ridiculous, and I think that must be hype. I don't see how anybody could really justify that. However, I am sure that there are financial backers who would love to see that kind of spend or near that spend, because that would then lead to even greater profit, I would suppose, for them, or a complete disaster. So I really don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but it does concern me. However, I will say crypto also concerned me from an ecological standpoint. Right? It was quite expensive to mine cryptocurrency. And I did express concerns from that. And I have actually never purchased cryptocurrency myself personally as kind of a moral decision. I felt that it was not a responsible thing for me personally to get involved with. And besides, I kind of go by the Warren Buffett credo, which is if you don't really understand it, don't. Although I understand it much better now, the crypto crash happened before I had any temptation to actually buy it. So now, who knows? I really, again, it's just not my area of expertise, but I have expressed the same concern for crypto as I would for AI in principle. On the other hand, no one ever really cared what I thought about crypto expense, right? It just wasn't something that I had a voice on, and so I stayed out of that fray, and I sort of listen and take in information, but I don't really sort of involve myself in it. In terms of the expense to me, I've subscribed to a few different language models, and I spend more than $100 a month, but I have spent tens of thousands of dollars a month hiring people to work for my startup. And so to me, $100 a month to replace that cost to me is well worth it. And that is kind of leads into the better experience with AI. I see benefits in me personally not having to hire a team or even an army potentially of developers to work with me. I am essentially not only a consultant, a programmer, trainer and so forth around domain-driven design and software architecture, but I am also an entrepreneur. And now I can truly be a solopreneur with AI, because I think that I can accomplish a lot in areas where I do not have the expertise in certain things. For example, I have done enough UI. In fact, I've had my own UI frameworks that I've developed in the past. But since then, I just haven't focused on those, and I just really do not want to have to learn, for example, React JS. I don't want to have to learn Vue, even though I think Vue is a little simpler. And I heard that Svelte was even easier. And so just jump into Svelte and you're going to be so happy. And I just haven't found any of that to be accurate either, right? Because, hey, software developers are as good at hype as some CEOs and founders of AI companies, right? So I now use LLMs to do things that I don't have an expertise at, but I also do not want to hire for. And so I lean on them, on the LLMs, to provide that kind of expertise for me. But I still find that it takes a lot of guidance. One point that I've been highlighting is speed and ability are there, craft is not. And so the craft still has to come from humans. After being in this industry for maybe more than half of the whole industry's lifetime, right? 43 years, I still have not seen the kind of progress that leaves software developers in the dust. And so while I may not currently be hiring, doesn't mean that human software developers can be ignored. I think that they still must focus on building their craft and use the LLMs to speed up their work, but the LLMs, at least at this point, are not going to replace software developers. They haven't replaced my knowledge. I can tell you that Claude talks a great line, but I still have to keep on top of it because it will tell me that it's doing something that it's absolutely not done. It has the knowledge, but it also can skip out on the details. And it moves so quickly that you can't even detect that sometimes. So you have to watch them very, very carefully, which I do. But even at that, when it generates thousands of lines of code within a few minutes, you can't catch every little nuance out there, every little difference that you're hoping that it's going to support you in the way that you have planned and that you've informed it, instructed it, prompted it to do, and yet it doesn't fully do that until you call it out and say, would you please take care of this for me? I do want to say that I am very polite to my LLMs, and how I view it is I am being polite to the Claude team, that I am paying vastly less than the quality that I'm getting from it if I had to hire the same people. So that to me deserves politeness. Now, I know on the other hand that some people are opposed to being polite to their LLMs because it costs more money to be polite. And I heard Sam Altman reply to that question. I took it as tongue-in-cheek, maybe a little bit sarcastic comment from Sam Altman. And he said, yeah, that costs millions of dollars. And to me, millions of dollars compared to the amount of spend that they have is a drop in the bucket. And they could actually filter all that out on the client side if they wanted to. They could filter all those polite words and just feed to the LLM the pure instructions. So I think, and I'm actually, told, oh, I'm glad you're happy with that. So I have the impression that if they are filtering it, not sending it to the LLM, they're dealing with that on the front end. But to me, I feel human. I feel genuine. And I would rather not dehumanize myself and turn myself into a robot talking to a robot. So that's why I do it.